We spent Christmas and New Year 2018 on Azamara Journey from Miami down to Havana, then Cartagena, Colombia, then the ABC Islands, back up to Santiago de Cuba, and then returning to Miami. On our way south to Havana, we stopped at Key West, where I went for a gentle kayak trip, while Margaret explored the town. The Florida Keys have a large population of iguanas, introduced by ships from South America. Cuba was the destination of most interest to us on this cruise. We had arranged private tours to make the most of our 2 days in Havana. We spent one day looking around the city, partly in this 1955 Buick and partly on foot. The historic centre is well maintained, with lots of Spanish colonial architecture. Away from the centre is mostly much more run down. Religion was initially banned after the Communist Revolution, but things are now much more relaxed. Cuba even had a visit from the Pope in 2015. On our other day in Havana, we went out into the countryside in another vintage American car. Outside the city, we saw as many horses and carts as we did cars. We visited an orchid garden and a tobacco farm. The farmers have to sell 90% of their produce to the government, but are allowed to make the remaining 10% into cigars that they can sell privately. There were very few people about, apart from at this cave and underground river, where we had to queue for ages. Cartagena, on the north coast of South America, is a large modern city with a small historic centre with similar Spanish colonial architecture to Havana. But whereas Havana was relaxed, Cartagena was extremely busy and touristy, with lots of street vendors touting for business. Curacao was the first of the 3 ABC islands we visited, and the most attractive. The Dutch influence is very apparent. There is a large floating bridge that swings across the river that runs through the main town. On our second ABC island, Bonaire, I went snorkelling on the Woodwind. The weather wasn't great when we set off, but soon improved, and it was an excellent trip. My dreadful underwater video doesn't do it justice, but we saw a good variety of fish, squid, octopus, turtles and corals. On Aruba, we took a tour on a rather ropey local bus. The interior of the island has some interesting scenery, but overall, Aruba has been overdeveloped and had little to interest us. And then we sailed back north to Cuba for a day in Santiago de Cuba on the southwest of the island. As in Havana, we had arranged a private guide. we set off in a 1958 Oldsmobile up to a great viewpoint via some very rough unmade roads. We had a look around what had been a coffee farm in the 19th century, then drove back to the city. San Juan Hill is the site of the last battle of the Cuban-Spanish-American War in 1898. Moncada Barracks is where Fidel Castro started his armed struggle that resulted in the 1959 revolution, celebrated by this grand monument. Since the revolution, all these mansions have been converted into schools, museums, and other public buildings. Like Havana, the historic centre is well maintained, but most of the city is much more run down. Our cruise then returned to Miami. As we had an evening flight home, we took a trip to the Florida Everglades to pass the time. Cuba was the highlight of this cruise, definitely well worth a visit.